Our speaker is Hillel Glazer. He comes with 23 years worth of experience in lean and quantitative analysis. And he's a father of 4, flies an airplane. He knows his stuff. So help me welcome our speaker this morning.
Beyond? Yep. Ooh, wow, it's loud. Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody. I'm really impressed to see this much of a crowd to talk about numbers. So you're doing it wrong, and how your decision making affects your, or why some of the way we've been making decisions affect poorly the outcomes, and what we can do about it. There's going to be a running theme, or a running joke, take your pick. No, it's really a running theme in the topic, and it's like I've coined the term, if you will, unpeeling an onion. So we know what peeling an onion is, right? You take the onion and you peel it, and unpeeling would be sort of like what, putting it back together, I suppose. And that's many of us who do a fault analysis or just process improvement, change management, trying to get to the bottom of things. We refer to, well, peeling the layers of the onion. You're going to work your way through it. You're going to work your way from the symptoms on the outside to what's going on the inside that is really at the heart of what's causing what's on the outside. Is anyone familiar with that analogy? Get to the middle of it to figure out why the ends or the outside are doing. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing in a lot of ways. We're going to look at what we want on the outside is we're going to define what that is. And then we're going to say, well, in order to get what we want on the outside to happen, to manifest as the symptoms of what's going on the inside. This is straight from Deming and systems thinking, right? This is from where if we can see all the problems with quality, we can see all the problems with organizational inefficiencies, and usually what we see those are just the symptoms of something deeper. And if we only address what's going on the outside, we'll never ever not be in a situation where we're constantly chasing after the next fire, the next fire that we're going to have to fight. And so the concept of fighting fires is usually because we have never addressed what's in the middle. Well, we're going to we're going to take this and turn it inside out. We're actually going to find out what is it that we want on the inside of an organization. What do we want to cause to happen at the core of an organization so that the performance, the high-performing organization is a symptom of what's going on the inside. So we want it to be obviously a good symptom. We want to see what needs to go on the inside that is the predictor, if you will, or a leading indicator of how do we know that the outside is going to be what we want. So we're kind of turning the analogy, the metaphor, if you will, on its head by looking at the inside. So you're going to see a picture like this. The picture is, we're not going to have it this big all the time, but there are going to be a handful, or here and there, in all these images, where once in a while I'll just put a little icon version of this picture, and that's usually a key point that is core to getting to the inside. So how do we know that we are performing well? That's sort of the outside edge. So we see that in our numbers, in the quarterlies or annuals, or in any kind of report and project success. When things are really working well, those should be the symptoms of what's going on the inside. So we'll look at a few concepts. So looking at things such as metrics, and using metrics as results against goals. Not to, it really, part of the thing that we're going to talk about is quantitative decision making or, versus deterministic decision making, or deterministic versus probabilistic decision making. And what we all celebrate, in fact, this morning, Richard Turner mentioned the OODA loop. And that's a great decision-making process. It's great for when you have complete situational awareness. It's great for when you know in advance what your choices are. And it's great for making rapid decisions to keep your butt from getting shot out of the sky. Okay? On the other hand, if that's the only way we know how to make decisions, because we don't understand the situation. We don't have complete situational awareness. We aren't aware of what we're capable of doing, which is a huge, huge component of the OODA loop. If you don't know what you're capable of doing, you're going to, in his case, is a fighter pilot, and I might throw in a few pilot analogies because, you know, John told you I was a pilot, and so that's what we do. How do you know there's a pilot in the room? He or she will tell you. So there's, in fact, I was at an awards event a few weeks ago, and they were filming CPAs and accountants and some other guys, and they interviewed them. And so at the end, they had like a blooper reel, like, so tell us something that no one else would think about. And he says, well, people might know I'm a private pilot. So I said to the guys, like, you know, there's always one in a crowd. How do you know? He's going to tell you. So, but what happens is that if he didn't know what the capabilities of his aircraft was before he got in the aircraft and started getting chased around by enemy fighters, he could have probably broken the plane and wouldn't have been able to pursue and become an ace. So the point is, you have to know the metrics, you have to know what those results are against the goals. You have to know what your capabilities are as opposed to speculating on what you think you might be able to get done. Has that ever happened? You get to a beginning of a sprint or a release planning session, and you're kind of like going, what can we do this time? You know, we don't really know what we can do this time if you don't have the metrics and to support it with known capabilities, because we've never really baselined what we're able to do. Too often in software, we're always saying to each other, well, it's always different, it's never the same. I'm just going to call BS on that. Okay? Yes, the products and a lot of the stuff are different, but fundamentally there is a core point at which we can normalize some of this to understand at the team level on this project what it's able to do. Just because this team and that team are different and they're doing different things doesn't mean that this team, forget that team, can figure out its business. Okay, yeah, I agree that if we were to come up with a single set of metrics that all teams were supposed to adhere to, that would be crap. Okay, but that's not an excuse to say that the team itself shouldn't figure out what its capabilities are and what its baseline abilities are able to do. The team, and whether it's a small group of people or a slightly larger group of people or multiple teams, there are ways, there are techniques to understand so that we're not constantly reinventing how we're going to make a decision. So the baselines are what we're able to do, and then using those baselines, we come up with models to predict future performance. Some folks are like, well, look, the models are always wrong. It's like, yes, what you got gets better. Okay, the models are never going to be perfect. We've got lots of models in lots of parts of our lives, weather models, for example. All the weather modeling on the planet didn't save people on the East Coast from Hurricane Sandy combining with that other East Coast storm that particular fall. They didn't predict exactly that, oh, by the way, when the hurricane comes ashore, it's going to take a sharp left turn and head off to West Virginia, which pulled in all the moisture from the northwest Atlantic onto New York City and and New Jersey. They didn't predict that. Billions of models got it wrong. But that's not an excuse to say all models are never useful. All models are wrong. It's just many are useful. That's a George Box saying. So instead of getting to where we are constantly coming up with the answer from scratch and reinventing an OODA loop, despite the fact that we don't know what we're capable of, despite the fact that we don't have the measures on what we're actually expected to be able to do, we want to get to, instead of estimates, getting to where we can forecast. So I'm sure that, has anyone here never dealt with an estimate? Never, ever, ever dealt with having to meet an estimate? Why did they call it an estimate if they expected you to hit it? Okay? I don't get that psychology either. It's an estimate. It's just, well, it's kind of a whatever. Well, on the other hand, what we're talking about our ability to do is to, with confidence, have a forecast much more confident than the weather on what we're capable of achieving, so that it's not just an estimate on, well, maybe we're going to do this if, you know, if the stars and the moon and the sun align in a certain way and nothing else changes and nobody gets sick and everybody's car works perfectly, this is what the estimate's going to be. How about a forecast based on models which are on known baseline capabilities? One organization had the tenacity, or whichever you want to call it, really. I think there's a wrong word to use. Anyhow, to say that, well, we don't actually collect metrics on what we achieved. We just change what we were supposed to have achieved and suddenly declare victory. Anybody you've experienced that. Okay, yeah, that's really agile. Okay, that's crap too, right? Okay, let's just, well, we're gonna build all these features this couple of weeks or this month, but we only got to like a third of them. So we're gonna just say that other that stuff, we didn't really mean it. So we're not gonna do it. Yeah, that's crap too. So we wanna not be doing that much longer, because I don't know about the rest of you, but if I have to do that, once is enough. I don't wanna do that again. I don't want to be put in a position where I'm going to be asked for an estimate, expect to nail it, and then when it's wrong, sort of have to eat crow or explain why it's not really my lack of engineering discipline, and I really don't want to say it's you, Madam Executive, and you're completely off the planet with what you think we can do. I don't want that conversation to ever come up again. So I try to avoid it in the first place. So forecast a set of estimates, and then having the confidence to know why something is or isn't possible. So the keys to all of this, you're going to see each time we come up with the picture of the onion. In case you don't remember what it looks like, that's what it looks like. So each there's a few aspects of what we're going to talk about where these are particular keys, and I'll end up summarizing them later. And John may not have mentioned this. Please raise your hand, wave, throw things, except maybe tomatoes. I like this shirt. But just to get my attention if I've missed something or misspoken, or you would like me to slow down or repeat something or really get a point of contention out of the way. Because the last thing I want you to do, other than leave, is to spend the next hour not getting something because of something I missed, and you really could have, used that not being a distraction in your head. So this is just, for some folks, they're all like, where did you come from and why did you talk, why are you talking about this? So I don't know when you guys know that the Agile Manifesto was written, but the draft of the first article I wrote on this topic was actually written the same time the Agile Manifesto was written, just the magazine that Richard mentioned this morning, that's Crosstalk. So that was a picture of Crosstalk. That came out the same year. You see some recognizable names here like David Anderson. So he and I have worked together for a while. That's my book. There's a bunch of other stuff. Yes, there's a bunch of CMMI nonsense on here. Yes, I had a lot to deal with CMMI forever and ever and ever and ever, but this Qatar Consortium IT actually just came out this month. So that's the most recent topic. You might want to find it. If you're not a member of the Qatar Consortium, you might talk them into getting you an issue. So it's the Qatar IT Journal. It's all about decision making. There are 3 executive briefings from this past spring and winter on the same topic, so you can look that up there. And just as a little background, I know John was very kind in ignoring most of my failures, but one of the things that I ended up spending a lot of time on has been CMMI, and it's really, I used that sort of as a proving ground for a lot of what I wanted to do because it was such a ripe opportunity. The fact of the matter is that CMMI has a big section toward the end about this kind of stuff, and that's where I was most interested in, was because that's really the high-performing part of an organization. Anybody here deal with CMMI at some point in their lives or at all? Okay, so most of you aren't. That's good. So consider yourselves lucky. For those of you that didn't, but and I'm not going to talk a lot about CMMI at all. I just wanted to give you some context that there's stuff in it. It's actually a really good model, believe it or not. It's been dreadfully abused by the market, and people don't know how to use it, and the government really screwed it up. But all that aside, if you just read it for what it's trying to do and what the model is, it's actually pretty strong. Really, when everything breaks down is when you try to appraise to the model, which is a completely different topic. Anyway, so let's talk about, Richard mentioned it in his keynote. You'll probably hear a lot of it throughout the next couple of days. You'll hear, and maybe many of you have been addressing in your own workplaces, this issue of scalability or maturity or agility and lean. And while all this sounds great, and we don't want it to be apple pie and motherhood, it's still missing a lot of the points. It's not the buzzword that too many people latch onto. It's not something you go get 2 hours or 2 days or a week of training on and suddenly you've achieved scalability or agility. You know, with all due respect to a lot of the leading thinkers that are trying to put frameworks together to make this stuff scale, if that's where your people focus on, they're missing the point. The point really is, anybody want to take a guess as to what we're trying to achieve with scalability, maturity, agility, or lean? What we're trying to achieve, and just think about that for a second. I'm not going to ask you to call it out unless you really want to. I can't stop you. But what we're trying to achieve is, there's philosophies, so okay, not that. Reducing uncertainty. Yeah, someone said predictability, right? What we're trying to achieve is increasing predictability and reducing uncertainty. Somewhere down the line, even PMBOK and traditional V models and big everything up front, all of that stuff, while some of it completely misguided, is trying to increase predictability and reduce uncertainty. And anything that doesn't actively do one of these two things in your agile or lean or scaling approaches is going to fall short of becoming a high performance operation. So if you're looking at how to increase performance in your operation and you are adding practices or deleting practices or you're reorganizing the organization or you're changing people's skill sets and roles, and somewhere along the way you're not seeing the direct one-to-one or one-to-many connection between doing that and either increasing predictability or reducing uncertainty, then you're probably going to not get out of it what you hoped to get out in the first place. So the talk today, what I'm talking about today and what we'll talk, I have a workshop on Wednesday, so anybody who really wants to dive into some of the particulars, that's what Wednesday's all about. So I'll apologize in advance because I'm not going to be able to give you an 8-hour tutorial in an hour and a half, an 8-hour workshop, I should say, in an hour and a half talk. But the rest of this talk is really going to be about how we are often making decisions in a way that is so surprisingly not doing either of these things, yet all of except for maybe a few of you who grew up and got educated in other countries. So anybody who was educated in the West or Europe, West, the United States, that kind of thing, the Americas, chances are you were taught how to make decisions this way all through graduate school. Your MBA taught you how to do this. We've got entire graduate schools of business named after people famous for inventing how to do this way, which is the part of the problem. So really what we're talking about for the rest of the morning is the things that are not helping and why they're not helping and how we can change that. And obviously, I'm not saying all decision making is to be following these types of approaches. All decisions, when we have no idea what we're doing, we need to collect a bunch of people and get some smart folks in the room too, and then try to start making our decision based on analysis. But when there are so many things we do, especially in software and systems development, there's so much that we can do that doesn't have to be just based on the smartest or the loudest person in the room, which is too much of our decision making happens. So here's how we typically make decisions. It's a very, 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 very cartoonish look at it. But for the most part, when we make decisions, we go through some kind of cycle where we've got some data or something generating data. Then as we go from the generation of the data, we analyze it, we use some logic, some reasoning, some judgment, and then we make a decision. Whether there's a loop in here within the thing that generates the data, action, business intelligence, and so on, reliable processes, defined, whatever. The operation produces the data generation, and we collect it, and as I said, we analyze it and go through some logic, reasoning, and judgment. And just because we've gone through logic, reasoning, and judgment, and just because we've got the data coming out of the operation, doesn't mean we necessarily know that our decision for what's to do next is going to be a smart one or an effective one. So, but we've all been kind of taught to do that. And here are 3 problems with that approach. I had someone really argue strongly against why this is wrong. And I'm like, okay, I'd love to argue about this, but I'd love for you to give me some proof that it's not true. So here's 3 of the problems with that approach. Number 1 is it's historical. That approach using data, logic, reasoning, decision, and so on is looking backwards. It's all based on the data we got, not what the data is going to be. And if we're always looking backwards on deciding what we're going to do next, it's like looking at the miles behind the car to figure out which direction you need to go next. So yes, there's some benefit to looking where you've been, but at the same time, if that's the only place you ever look, you're going to end up crashing a lot. So we're always looking using data that's old and historic in nature, even if it's just days or weeks old, but we're still applying the rest of it, which gets into the next set of problems. We're looking at models using what every disclaimer at the bottom of a prospectus in our stock portfolio says. Some of you could probably quote it. Past performance does not indicate future performance. So we're basically taking that disclaimer and we're saying we're going to ignore you and make decisions anyway. So there's that problem, is that it's taking the historical information and it is relying on that historical information for the performance of the future performance of the business, the operation, just like we sometimes do with stock. And finally, the third fault is that it's based on people. It's based on people, and all of us have biases. And there are cognitive biases, there are non-cognitive biases, there's lots and lots of bias in our experience, and what we stink at a lot of times is trying to make a decision without our bias. And even when you get a group of people together, and their collective bias, in theory, is supposed to cancel some of it out, we're still dependent on that group of people. And if it happens to be different from one day or the next, or someone just happened to watch something on the news or get something on Facebook or listen to a particular guru make their point, suddenly their entire worldview changes before they showed up to your meeting and you're expecting them to think in a certain way and now they don't. So basically what we're saying is that if we're constantly looking backwards, if we're constantly projecting forward based on looking backwards and using people as the only way to figure out what we're going to do next, we are lucky when we make the right decision and it works out well, but we don't look at it that way. Why? Because we're biased not to look at it that way. We've survived as a species by bucking the odds in that way. But see, here's the irony. That works perhaps pretty well as a people, but we're talking about technology and it's a lot less forgiving. You know, computers and hardware don't really take well to ambiguity. So we have to be a little bit better at it when we're doing that stuff. So what can we do? First, let's recognize the fact that it's not just one big, massive effort where at the beginning we make all the decisions or get all the data, and at the end we make all the decisions. Let's look at it as actually it's a breakdown of work. There's different steps to the work, and that data is generated before and between each set of steps. And we can actually cut the amount of decision making from one big one to smaller ones. And so yes, there'll be that big arrow would be in between here and here. But then we're not just continuing, we'd actually make a decision and go back. So first things first, cut things up into smaller pieces. And we all heard that from Lean and Agile, so that's nothing new. So we talk a lot in Lean about flow. We talk a lot in Lean about waste. But very often we let one or the other win where it shouldn't. So this is something to keep in mind. If you've read David Anderson's Kanban book, he points this out. Value trumps flow, and flow trumps reducing waste. Very often, a lean initiative, we'll call it, at an organization will go around looking for the reducing waste part and never ever get to some of the things that make lean truly work, which to increase flow. So reducing waste is usually pretty easy. Remember, notice the little icon. This is important. Reducing waste is pretty easy. We're usually obvious. They're kind of obvious, and we're going around and eliminating stuff when it's not working for us, so we stop doing it. So, because if someone said this was stupid, let's stop doing it. So it's wasteful, we stop doing it. But there's always going to be a certain amount of waste, and sometimes we're eliminating waste and suddenly things stop working and we wonder why. Because we forgot that value trumps flow and flow trumps reducing waste. So let's look at some practical examples. Here's 4 examples of value trumping flow, okay? Value trumping flow, so this is a much more valuable way to move a lot of cargo a very long distance. That's value. It's not very fast, but pound for pound, it is high value. So if it's okay that we move something slowly, but don't pay a ton for it, then shipping stuff in big cargo containers has a lot of value, value trumping flow. Time with the family is value trumping flow. It doesn't, the faster this event happens, the higher the value, no. Okay, we don't want this to be fast. So we don't want this to, we don't want to, okay, we got to sit down at 3:30 today to play the game. We've got until 4:15 to finish playing the game. Okay, because that's all of our family, quality time is 45 minutes. No, that's not how it really works. And if that's how it works in your family, don't talk to me. I don't want to hear it. So you're not allowed to ask questions. So, those people. So other issues, you're at the wrong conference. So there's a value trumping flow. Clearly, the flow of this is not going to be the higher value. Value trumps flow. This is high value activity. And of course, if this was your lunch or dinner, and speeding through it is not where you get the value. You probably paid more because of this view than for what's actually on the plate. The cost of getting the thing onto your plate and, from beginning to end is not what you're paying for. So taking your time to enjoy this meal is where the value comes in. And these are just examples to help you get a visceral understanding or appreciation for value trumping flow. But the nerd in me really couldn't get past this one image for flow trumps reducing waste. Okay, so a purist about reducing waste would probably look at this and say, well, clearly this car is generating an enormous amount of waste. So if anybody want to take a quick guess as to why I would say that this is, in this picture we can see, let's forget the emissions for the moment, that there's an enormous amount of waste being produced in this image in the form of heat, right? In the form of heat, all kinds of waste. Okay, so let's take that engineering principle to its logical but insane conclusion, that if an engineering principle was around reducing waste at the expense of flow, we would never put brakes on cars. And we would design cars so that we would always figure out what the total distance is before we start, accelerate to a certain point, and then let go of the gas that we eventually slow down to the point where we want to reach. They somehow would magically get rid of friction, but let's ignore that for the moment. We did this all the time in engineering, where they pretend there's no friction. I was like, but come on. We actually also made things out of things called miraculum. The unyielding, unbendable, unbreakable material that anything could be supported on it. So we did all kinds of stuff like that. But, and just think about it this way. Everything we do throughout our entire lives was engineered on an approximation. So wrap your head around that. On science that was just a theory, and on math that is purely flawed. And we live every day, So be scared, very scared. I'm kidding. So there's all kinds of waste in here, but if we ever really want to get anywhere in this mode of transportation, there has to be waste. We can't eliminate all the waste and still expect to get value or flow. So if value trumps flow and flow trumps reducing waste, then value trumps reducing waste. It's sort of a necessary thing. So if you really are wondering how effective your operation is, that's another way to measure it. Compare the generation of value to the generation of, or lack, or reduction in waste. And if those numbers are too close, there's a problem. Okay, because you're barely breaking, sometimes reducing waste is more important than generating value. You're losing money or something. You're not feeding enough people, or you're not moving enough people in transit or something. But if the generation of value is lower than the reducing waste part, yeah, we wonder why certain projects don't really work out when the government handles them. So here's a few things you can start measuring simply by breaking up the work into little pieces. And I'm really going to focus on these 4 pieces. Yeah, there a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, John, figures.
What about rework?
What about rework? Due to?
Rework, software rework, would that be a waste?
Due to?
Not understanding requirements, implementing too fast, unrealistic environments.
Yes, so the answer, the only times rework is not waste is when you are intentionally using the creation of a product to learn from the experience of creating the product. Prototype, or just proving something out, or a spike, or just trying to figure out what the minimum viable product is, or minimum marketable product or feature is. So if you intentionally built if you built a product with the intent that this is what you're shipping, and you shipped defects, or you couldn't ship it because of the defects, then that is definitely waste. But if you build with the intent of learning, I wouldn't say that that's waste. In fact, that's one of the failures, thanks for bringing it up, John, because that's one of the failures of traditional project management, product development, and the way a lot of organizations fund and budget for work. The failure is that they don't recognize the fact that spending a little bit of money now to figure something out is a lot more cost effective in many cases than spending a whole lot of time thinking you're right. So the government went off in its infinite wisdom, and this isn't just federal government, lots of governments do this. They will allocate the entire $500 million for a project, not knowing what they really want, when what they could have done was allocated maybe 10 million out of $500,000. Or $1 million, just figuring out the requirements first, and then budgeting incrementally. Budget every $50 million 10 times over 10 years, as opposed to $500 million up front. Okay, that's just a failure of of just how we think, but we've all been taught to do it that way. It's because we call it failure when we don't get it right the first time. That's just a screwed up Western type of thinking. And I'm part of that system as well, so I'm not just saying, I learned somewhere better than you. No, I learned here. So time, defects, anything that moves, and volume of stuff. All these things are easy to measure, especially as software folks. And this is where people say, but it's always different, it's always this, it's always that. So there's always, yes, but that's not an excuse not to measure these 4 things. And that doesn't, so whether it's time, defects, the movement of the volume of stuff, or the movement of things, whether it's moving in one direction in the flow or the opposite direction in the flow, these are all things we can measure and within a particular product line or a particular team, not person. So when we can wrap our heads around, these are very simple, they're always there. Usually our tools are capturing this anyway, we're just ignoring them. So here we talk a little bit more about flow. Key point, there's no such thing as a conversation about flow until we're having a conversation about slack. And that's where folks start to nod off, because like, that's complicated. No, really, it's not. So here is the famous set of images. Now, on first glance, which side of the road is moving faster? Probably. Right. This side? Okay. All right. Why? Oh, what an inefficient use of that road. Okay. Yeah, you're probably right. This side is probably moving faster than that side because there's space on the road. So you want more things out the other end of the road, then you want to have more space. But in case it really wasn't obvious to you, I have a couple more tries. Okay? So our development efforts are no different than these highways. And what often happens in many organizations is that we are measured as developers, as project leaders, as technicians, as whatever, as if we're the road. And the software or the hardware or the technical work are the cars. When it's actually the wrong level of discussion. We are the cars getting stuff done. And the road is the operations and the systems within which we operate, within which we live. It's the tools, the techniques, the systems, the communications, the hierarchies that our organization has created for us or that we exist within or subsist within. And that's having the conversation. So when people say, and so again, I don't know any of you, I don't think, except that, I had dinner with Bill, but other than that, so I'm about to step on a lot of toes. This is why the matrix organization doesn't work. Because the matrix organization is trying to optimize the road as if we are the road, as if more cars on the road means we are always busy doing something that's value add, when in fact, more cars on the road is a traffic jam. More cars on the road doesn't mean we actually can move faster, it just means we all move at a slower rate. And in fact, while it's, how many times do you see fender benders on this side of the road and nothing on that side of the road? So we actually increase the risk of people running into each other when we overload the infrastructure, when we overload the road. If you were to count, go back a couple of images and stand on top of this bridge, go back a couple of images, and count the number of cars over a 5 or 10 minute period. And if we are the cars, or the tasks are the cars, and we are getting things done, this side of the number of cars going through that point at a 5 minute period would be higher than the number of cars going through that point. Now, maybe this picture is not as good because this road is just about saturation. So it's probably reached that point where this might be, in this picture, a little bit more productive because they haven't crossed the saturation point like these two pictures have. So there is a roughly 80%, in case you were wondering, 80% of total utilization, more or less, between 70 and 80, is, depending on what you're doing, is about the saturation point. So just in case you were keeping score, so many organizations, especially those doing Agile, have said, okay, we're going to say the ideal amount of time for someone to be working is, we recognize it's not 8 hours a day. So we're only going to give them 6 hours a day, and that's what we're going to measure what our capacity as a team is for our Scrum velocities. Sound familiar to some folks? Okay, so it's 80% of 6, not 80% of 8. Okay, that's the number we should be using. We should be using more like 4.5, 5 hours, something like that, not 8, not 5, I mean 4.5, 4 to 4.5, not 6 of 8. In any case, so what happens when we don't have slack? Well, if we're constantly on the road, we're constantly doing the tasks at hand, we will never have time to respond. We won't have the room to maneuver. We won't be able to do anything that's not the task at hand. Because I can almost guarantee that most of our work, when we feel like we're on this, is not fixing the database or re-indexing or fixing the tools or coming up to speed or getting rid of technical debt. This is usually the original work we were supposed to do, let alone all the stuff we didn't plan for in the first place. So when, if something were to happen on this side of the road, say a deer were to suddenly cross over the road, well, these cars might have, or a single lane is blocked by something, these cars have a lot more capability to maneuver. But if a deer were to suddenly walk onto this road and drop dead in the middle of it, these cars, while not moving very quickly, and let's assume that this on-ramp wasn't there for a minute, because let's assume that this was a sidewall like this is. These cars wouldn't be able to get around it very easily. They'd have to wait longer before they can get around it because there's just nowhere to go. They're not moving very fast. It's scary because these cars look like they're moving and those cars look like they're not. So that's something for folks that want to go back and say, pick up the banner and go fight the good fight to stop the matrixed organization, use those pictures or find your own, actually. So say, hey, this is not, we don't have time we don't have the space or the capacity to do stuff that's not that here, because we don't have any slack. Where does all the improvement happen? If you don't have any time, because you're always busy doing other stuff, to look at the process, to look at the methods, to look at technical debt, to look at the indexing of your data, or whatever needs to be rebuilt, to even think about design and architecture, nobody has the time, and then they wonder why the products don't really do what they want. Yeah.
Hillel, would you make the connection, please, between what it is about the matrix organization that drives the process into an insufficient slack?
Yeah, absolutely. The matrix organization's goal, I'm not saying cross-functional organization, I'm saying matrix organization. That's sometimes people confuse the two, and just want to make sure I'm clear about what I'm talking about, matrix organization. Matrix organization tries to keep everybody 100% utilized on task stuff, so that they're going to be task switching between project and project and project, that they're going to be utilized on only things that are on the project, so that they are constant. There's no, the goal of matrix organizations are to eliminate the slack in the person's week or month or whatever. That's different from a cross-functional organization where you might be matrixed for what you do or the role that you play. But I'm just going to talk purely trying to make it so that there's no hour in any day of my week where I'm not on some project. And then one of the things, and I'll actually, it's not in my slide set, so this is something I'll mention. One of the things that inhibits agility and lean is the lack of instantly available resources. And the matrixed organization is the epitome of non-instantly available resources because they're allocated to somewhere else. So when I'm in a matrix organization, when the conditions change, you simply can't respond to that change because everybody's time is committed to something somewhere on someone's project chart. So is there something more that you're looking for?
Follow-up conversation.
Okay. So, I cut my teeth in a matrix organization, and the only reason why we could ever get, some of us, not all of us, but the only reason some of us could get all of our work done was because it was a dreadfully inefficient organization. And so it was matrixed, but it was just everything moved slowly. So we could, if that's the organization you're in, nothing happens fast, then matrices aren't so fast. And we weren't measured on productivity either. So nobody was in a hurry to get that battleship turned around. So, that worked out pretty well there. But there was a couple of folks where they had their hair on fire. Let's spell it out for you. Slack does these things. Without slack, we can't actually reduce variation. Okay, variation there's a major echo when I stand here. Variation is what we're going to talk a lot about here. Because when we don't know, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, so let me just not get into it too far, because there'll be a picture. So variation is what is a strong source of poor quality. Slack allows us to increase productivity by giving us space to maneuver. It is counterintuitive because we're not trained. We're trained by Arthur Sloan to keep everybody busy, and Frederick Taylor and others. Been trained by these guys to keep everybody busy. If you actually want to get from point A to point B, you can't be in a road jam, in a traffic jam. Traffic jams don't get anywhere in any efficient amount of time. So really, if you want to take it to its logical conclusion, if you don't have slack, you're literally not moving. Okay? So it drives continuous improvement because it frees up the space to have continuous improvement. And if you really want to measure yourself on agility or maturity or whatever scale you like, look at how much slack their teams have. The teams without slack are actually going to be less mature. They're going to be much more lockstep and unable to make their own decisions. So variation, big conversation. Notice I put the little onion here on that word, not the whole thing. So variation. Just to be clear about the difference between variation and variability. Variability is how many dice you have. It's the number of different ways in which something can be different. Okay, and variation is how many sides each die has. So variability is, and we'll talk a whole lot more about this in the workshop on Wednesday, but variability is, I can be, size, color, and shape. Those are 3 choices in variability. Variation is how many colors, how many sizes, how many shapes. Now, often we have situations where there's too much variability. It shouldn't change in these things. That's one problem. That's more about waste. But variation is something that we normally can change. It's sort of like Henry Ford's famous saying, they can have any color they want as long as it's black. Okay, and that wasn't because he liked black. It was because in his highly optimized supply chain, black was the only way to build cars, because otherwise it would slow down the car production process and make it more expensive to run and make it more expensive to buy, and he would screw up his entire supply chain. Henry Ford's supply chain, he owned the forests from which the wood was cut for the steering wheel and other wooden parts in the car. That's how extensive his supply chain was. He owned the forests in South America or elsewhere in the US to cut down the timber. That's ridiculous. Today that's impossible, but he did it, and that's also why Henry Sloan ate his lunch in the 30s. So, cycle time variation. I've had often occasion to call this the one metric that rules them all, or the magic metric, because really there's so much that ties into cycle time variation. What do we mean by cycle time variation? It's just the measure of how many times it takes to get through something. I mean, from how different each time it is to get through something. Cycle time variation, when you have more of that, you have more uncertainty. The uncertainty leads to a lack of confidence in making decisions, taking longer to make decisions, requiring more attention to work details, so that you have high-level people having to pay attention to the tiny little details, and there's less freedom to make progress. So because things are uncertain, just for a minute, I don't want to gloss over this too quickly. If you were an executive of a business and you were not sure, just put yourself in the position of being that person that has to make a decision. You're unsure of what the right thing is to do. So because you're unsure, you don't have the confidence in making decisions. Because you don't have the confidence, you'll take longer to make decisions. And because that's where the source of personality issues aside, one of the most common sources among otherwise reasonable people to micromanage is because they are unsure of whether the decisions they are making have any basis on reality. And so they will have to paying attention to details is like another way of saying micromanaging, or just you dealing at the very low level of work, and less freedom to make progress, because when you can't make a decision, you can't make progress. So all decisions rest on progress. Sorry, other way around. All progress rests on decisions, and surprisingly, all decisions also rest on progress. Decisions rest on feedback. Where is uncertainty from? Uncertainty comes from your operation. Cycle time variation, that's uncertainty. The more uncertainty, the more cycle time variation, the more uncertainty. This side of the actual ecosystem is your actual process behavior. You can only observe that. You can only observe the actual process behavior. You would measure this and call that's your performance. So what you are observing on this side is you're actually observing performance. From the performance, you gather certain measures, data, indicators, information, decisions, feed that back into the operation, which then gives you back this observation, which then you start over again, similar to the arrow we had before. But on this side, whereas this is the actual process behavior, because it's what the operation does. It produces a widget, it comes out, you could measure that. That's actual. On the other hand, from here forward, from this point forward, from performance, just above performance, all the way through until you stick it back into the operation, it's actually perceived behavior. We perceive what's going on here because this is just us doing analysis. This is what all that analysis and logic and decision-making stuff was in that previous image that we saw earlier. So we are perceiving what we think we know about the situation, and then we feed what we think we know about it into the operation, which then does whatever it's actually going to do, and then produces the next set of data, which we then move forward with. The bigger the difference between the actual and the perceived is, the more cycle time variation you can expect. So when you have the actual ecosystem doing one thing and we perceive it to do another and we're off, chances are, in fact, not even chances, what's happening is you have more uncertainty, you have more cycle time variation, which then means that the lack of slack is one of many causes of cycle time variation. Cycle time variation causes lag. That's a key term. I made it hopefully painfully obvious. How is it that cycle time variation, and what's this business about lag, and why is lag so important? Well, let's go back to making decisions. If we are uncertain about our decision and we take longer to make them, we are increasing the lag between when an event happens and when we're able to decide what to do, and then what we do about it. You know, that's what happens when a decision has to go to committee. And by the time that a committee makes a decision, the event is so far into the past that it's almost irrelevant. The term, when I worked for the Department of Defense, the term OBE, anybody remember what OBE means? Overtaken by events. I honest to God believe that almost every single thing the government has ever bought was made by decisions overtaken by events. I really don't remember real decisions ever being made. I'm sure they had to have happened. I mean, somebody, and it was usually by the contractor and not by the government. Of course, the contractor got blamed if it went wrong, and they didn't get paid if it went well. So, but somewhere along the way, planes ended up in the sky, and we flew them. So, cycle time variation causes lag. Lag is what we're after. When we start down this path, so I asked, you know, the beginning of my talk talked about what to do about it. We're going to focus from now on the what to do about it. Do something about lag. Remember when we talked about value trumps flow and flow trumps reducing waste? You want to look for places where flow isn't happening and value isn't being delivered. Find the lag, and you will find the problem. Agility, about being able to ability to respond, ability to be innovative, ability to know what's going on, is not consistent with lots of lag in your operation and your system, as Deming would say. So lag affects the workflow and decision-making, information innovation, but what can you do about it? Eliminate the sources of variation, dampen the impact of variation, and you will address lag. Eliminate the lag, you eliminate the variation. Lag is actually the source of the variation. And in case it really, really wasn't obvious, the lag comes from the time it takes to do this. Because the bigger the delta between the actual and the perceived, the longer you're going to take to do this every single time you go through it. So look about that. And there's another visual coming up soon. So let's talk about uncertainty and lag here. So this is that cycle in that loopy picture I had a second ago. I just made it a single linear process. And here's where the failure often happens in our schooling, and especially at higher education, like graduate school, MBA programs. We are taught Excel as the solution. And not good Excel. We're just taught Excel to give us the data we want to see. Okay, and we do these analysis, you get the performance, you go through, and what happens is we behave as though what we know about reality is a single data point. And we focus all of our attention on that data, we come up with another data, we focus all of our attention on that next point, and whatever it becomes, we focus all of our attention on that as if that is what's going to happen. And then we use this entire lengthy process to justify to management why that's the right decision. So all of our decisions, our subsequent decisions are constrained each time by a single point, and we behave as if that is at that point. Look at all this justification we have. There is no way we missed anything. So we behave as though each step, whoa, okay, go away. And, all right. So we behave as though each step is narrowly pointing ourselves towards the best single decision. It turns out that that's complete sophistry. But that's a term I actually almost never used until I read it in a book on decision making. Basically, we just invent a definition that meets our needs. Okay, so we start with the false premise that our data is good in the first place, and then we fill the rest of the premise with a delusionally optimistic view of how good our analysis is. And we've convinced ourselves that it's right, because after all, we spent days on the spreadsheet. So we're picking a single point to the exclusion of a lot of other things, and all the other points, and basing that decision on one thing, whether we realize this or not. Well, after all, we've been taught that way. The fact of the matter is that every single point is actually a range of points, only those are inconvenient to deal with, the range on this side, and then there's a range of the outcomes, and there's another range of the data. So we've decided, because it's a lot easier, and the executives are so ADD, there's no way we could walk them through all this. So we just want to pick the most popular approach, taking the one answer, and we've eliminated, we operate as though there's certainty and that we're moving towards certainty. And it turns out we are actually making a decision at a point where mathematically, quantitatively, we actually have the least amount of certainty, because we've eliminated all of this data all along the way. So instead of narrowing towards a high level of certainty, we're actually making decisions at a point where we know the absolute least about the situation, because we've eliminated all the other options every time we moved up the step. And oh, by the way, for that effort, we've increased the error, the lag, compounding the error because we've skipped everything, and we've only increased uncertainty as we've gone up the ladder. So that's where, lag rules. Here's the event. All the time, these T's were, for those math nerds out there, I don't mean these are all equal, but bear with me. I'd have more to explain if I actually went, STUVWX, So the point here is each step adds lag. The time between when the event happens and when we move on that event is huge. That's why lag rules. That's why the uncertainty comes from the lag. That's why the variation comes from the uncertainty and from the lag. It's a little triangle, which I don't draw. One image. So here's, I promised you one image in case you could not figure out how, something real. This is all theoretical. No, it's really not theoretical. All right. So this is you or your wife or your daughter in traffic, and what this person wants to know is, when are they going to get home to their screaming baby? They're sitting there, not going anywhere, and that's the question of the moment. When am I going to get home? She doesn't know. None of us know. She's not moving. How can she possibly know when she's going to get home to her screaming baby if she's not moving? We've got Waze now, and Waze does a pretty good job once in a while of giving us an estimate, because Waze kind of knows a little bit more about what's going on the road, but it's not perfect. Really funny. Waze, it was bought by Google, but the actual company comes from Israel, and there's a really hysterical story that that Israel a couple of years ago, before Google bought them, had a very huge amount of rain. And one of the main highways that runs through Tel Aviv is kind of like a highway in LA. It's right next to a water channel. Well, the water channel flooded, the highway flooded. Well, what Waze saw was, look, no traffic, and sent everybody there. So anyway, it was really kind of funny. And so this woman wants to know when she's going to make it home. She doesn't know because she's not moving. She wants to know how to improve her route. She doesn't know because she's not moving. She doesn't have the information. And just because, the accident could be 200 yards in front of her, but if there's no exit, doesn't matter. She's not moving. How long is it going to take to clean up the accident? God only knows. So that's the whole point. Lag is one of the things Agile, what incremental and iterative development is trying to do, is the whole idea of incremental and iterative development is to increase feedback. Increasing the feedback reduces the lag, because it's a faster rate of knowing what's going on. So here's a simple way to start. So the answer to how do we get started is what do we do about it? Start by simply these steps to eliminate lag and promote flow. I'm not going to wholesale change anything. Just start here. Sometimes what we're doing is we're simply starting with enough to gather the data to go make the case for change. We need to make a case for change. So here's where we're starting. First, break up the work. That's the first thing to do, as we showed before. Break up the work. And let's keep this out here for a minute. Break up the work, come up with how to move the work. You'll notice this starts to look a little bit like this, only instead of ignoring the ranges, we're going to use all of the ranges. So ask yourself the question, we break up the work, do we follow the processes? Okay, do we follow the workflow? Are we in the workflow? Are we out of the workflow? Are we going in the right direction in the workflow? And of course, there's all the workflow measures that you can be taken. If not, why not? There's not wrong necessarily to not follow the process or the workflow. That's probably an information for you. If you're not following the workflow, that's probably information that's important. Why aren't we following the process? Why not is more important than yes or no. If yes, is it really helping and is it working? Because sometimes we end up with a bunch of automatons and they follow the process no matter what. That's not going to be helpful either if we're not producing what we want to produce. But to simply ask the question, do we follow it? If not, why not? And if yes, is that really producing value? Does it work? Everyone has to be able to have the authority and the autonomy and the empowerment to simply observe what's going on, have an opinion about it, and make changes to their immediate surroundings to get the value up. The value to trump the flow and the flow to trump the waste. Okay? If they don't have this, you've got other problems in the organization. There's some management issues. If they're afraid to let people do this, then we're going back to the uncertainty. So here, we may not be able to necessarily put this in first, but be clear that this is where we want to go. Attack any impediments to quality, such as poor reviews, poor testing, all the stuff that we all know about. This is the 32nd year. I hope some of you have learned something by now. So, of course, most of you are too young to know. Anyhow, so the attack impediments to quality, including me, prioritize work by its greatest overall value, group similar work together. So instead of having 2 people per team doing the same thing that maybe isn't unique to that team, maybe make a team of 4 people that do it for everybody, as one example. Prioritize work by group work similar together. Broaden individual horizons so that individual members of the project don't just know their job, that they also know other people's jobs, both before and after where their roles come in, so that they are able to be more productive in helping them get their work done or prepare the work to be done by the next person. And push authority to the edge. So that is not every time for every decision needs to go up the chain of command, wait for a decision, and come back down. It's similar to what I had earlier about observe, analyze, and adjust. So wherever that edge is, wherever it's comfortable to be, just identify where and when we can start reducing lag by pushing that authority to the edge. Maybe setting thresholds. Is this a one-day kind of decision? If I'm wrong, I lost a day. Or is it a one-sprint decision? If I'm wrong, I lost a sprint or I lost a release. Maybe setting thresholds for where that point can be, where you're comfortable or management's comfortable letting the authority be pushed to the edge. And it doesn't. So there's not every single decision needs to go up to the product owner or to the product manager or to the vice president of development or whatever. Find out where those things can happen. Next, limit work in progress, which is very hard to do if you're not got the other components that we talked about so far, but we'll talk about how to do this. Allow slack to develop and then don't fill it. That's also difficult, but it's once we see what we're going to do. Increase visibility through greater delivery frequency, which means iterate and increment. Reduce transaction costs, because transaction costs are lag. What kind of transaction cost? Goes back to the matrix, is 1 point transaction cost. Every time I got a task switch, that's a transaction cost. Every time I got a batch work, not necessarily from a batching the systems technology-wise, but batching the work off, and I can't get feedback so that I'm waiting for milestones or waiting for events in the program to give me feedback, that's a transaction cost. Boosting signal and reducing noise. Oftentimes our systems that we operate in are really, really noisy. There's so much going on that we don't know what's noise and what's signal. Try to boost the signal. Find out what's the thing that needs to be done. Clarity in the backlog, clear goals, clear measurable success are some of the things that boost the signal? Is this being delivered? Do we see the outcome, or is it stuck somewhere in process? So boosting signal, reducing the noise. The noise causes the lag. It's like, as a pilot, sometimes, and it hasn't happened very often, and it never really put me in any danger, but it's a little disconcerting to be in a cloud and not hear the air traffic controller's instructions. Or know that he has directed another plane who's above me but out of the clouds, that I'm in the clouds and he shouldn't descend. Or he's given an instruction, it's like, was that for 5-4 Tango or is that somebody else? He goes, no, maintain 3000 heading 320. I'm like, okay, thank you. But it's too noisy, there's too much chatter, or somebody's mic is stuck and we can't hear him. Shorten response times. Response times is just another word for lag when they're too high. So, how do you start? How do you start that shift toward better flow, reduced lag? This is actually the title of a great pamphlet. If you can get your hands on it, I highly recommend Stop Starting, Start Finishing. I can get you a URL. I don't have it here. So Stop Starting, Start Finishing. How do you shift? Just take the work you already have and get it done without starting new work. Because that's easier to measure when you're, as opposed to the disruptive nature of additional work, increasing the noise. So one way to isolate and measure what's going on is don't add new noise, don't add new work. This set of steps, visualize the workflow like I showed you with the arrows, identify all the work that needs to get done in order to consider the work to be done. Not the developer's done with it and the tester's done with it, therefore it's done. No, is it shippable or is it usable by the next set of people? There's a wall, we can't get past that wall. Is it that done? Not just I'm done, but is it done? Visualize the work, identify all the work, which often isn't even part of the normal development test cycle. There's other stuff that has to happen. So identify all the work. So I could have maybe even underlined or changed the color on this word, identify all the work. It's really critical. Not hard to do, actually, but critical. See where the work is actually happening. Where is the work? Note where the work piles up. Get rid of the piles of work, figuratively, starting from the end and working backwards. So often when we're building workflows and we're trying to clean up a workflow, we actually start with the beginning of the workflow instead of the end. Well, what we're trying to do here is not to prove that the workflow works. We're simply trying to get stuff out of the workflow and measure it as we're getting it out. So starting at the end of the workflow, the thing that's closest to being really, really done, start with that. And just because you got it done doesn't mean you add something into the beginning of the workflow. The door on that is still closed. Stop starting, start finishing. So the thing that's closest to being done, get that out. Then move up. Start whatever's right before that, whether it's systems test or integration test or user acceptance test or whatever it is, get that all the way to out the door. And keep working your way backwards until there's absolutely nothing left to do. This will set you up. Now, that's obviously ideal, but this is, if we don't know what ideal is or looks like, we won't get it right, even if we have to make some changes or adjustments. But the point is that you can measure how long it actually takes to get stuff done when you're not interrupted by new work. Okay, if you're constantly interrupting what needs to get done with new work, you're not actually measuring what it took to get the stuff out the door. Unless you're actually capable of knowing what it takes to get the stuff out the door. So why, all this additional work, well, I don't know, was I working on this or was I working on that? Because really, some people are like, well, what do these people do? They're now done. Oh, no. If you have 4 developers who are, I'm going to, for the moment, say they are assigned to development, whether they are cross-functional or not. But you have 4 people assigned to this part of the product, and you have 2 people, or development, and you have 2 people assigned to this, or 1 person assigned to that part of the development, or worse, you have a fraction of a full-time person, because you're matrixed, actually assigned to that work. Then, if what you're trying to do is measure how long it actually takes to get done, and these people are not instantly available to do, you will never figure that out. You'll never actually figure out what it takes to get done because the work is constantly, I'm not saying stop all that other stuff forever. I'm saying, do you ever want to get a handle on it? Carve out a week or 2 or 3 or a month and let this happen. so that you actually understand what we talked about in the middle of the onion, what you are capable of doing. You'll never get to what you're capable of doing if you don't stop and measure it. And if you keep screwing up with what it is, it's sort of like, I want to measure how fast I can run a mile. Just a stupid example. And if I'm constantly interrupting that by stopping every now and again for doing something else, taking a phone call or working out with some other weights or changing running from running to stairs, I'm never going to know how long it takes me to get a mile if I don't just get a mile done a few times. Because I'm constantly being interrupted by other stuff. Now, lifting weights and answering the phone and doing stairs or elliptical are all productive things, but they really keep me from measuring that mile. So measure what it actually takes to get stuff done. Don't start something in the workflow if there's no room for it downstream. So that's going back to start at the end and work backwards. That means everybody shift focus to what's on the end and what they can do, and then work backwards, the same thing we just talked about. So if there's no room, if I'm, say, the integration guy, and I'm booked with something else, that means help me with my integration stuff. Don't start stuff that I can't get to just because you have nothing to do. Take some slack off of me or go do something else. Don't keep something in that's going to impact my bottleneck from just getting worse. Don't let something move from one step to the next until you know it's right. Don't say I'm done with it and then throw caution to the wind, play roulette with whether or not it's truly done. Because if it's not truly done, what don't we know? What it actually took to get it done. And getting it done isn't just done, it's done right. So don't let something move until you know it's right, and write down what it took to make it right. So all of the work and the rework, why was there the rework? Figure that out. Don't let it pass downstream. As soon as you produced a defect, and added rework, you've just screwed up a lot of the measures. So work on less, show off more. That's just another way of saying demo. It's just a way of saying communicate what you've gotten done. Take the time to get everybody on the same page. Just another word for communicate. Demo, communicate, coordinate, synchronize, any of those words, that's what I mean by show off more. And sometimes it's not necessarily in front of the product owner or the customer, just as a team. Stay in communication, know what's going on. This will cause slack to develop. Don't start filling it. If you're just starting this process, you have no idea what you're doing on figuring out what the slack load's supposed to be, or how much slack. So don't just start filling it, and that's going to be a little bit of a selling job to whoever likes the idea of filling your time just to make it look like you're being productive. That's usually a chief financial officer. I have yet to meet a chief financial officer that has a technical background like anybody in this room. Okay, so it's rare. Now, I could do chief financial officer, chief operating officer kind of stuff because I've been in your seats and I've done that kind of thing. So I'd be a very different chief financial officer. I'd be more like, are we building the right thing kind of chief financial officer, not are we spending the right money doing it. But normal chief financial officers are just counting beans. They're not the people who are really we need to worry about. We need to worry about, are we going to have a product at the end of the day that is going to have customers buying it so we can all feed ourselves. So allow slack to develop. Don't fill it, at least for as long as this experiment, as long as the experiment lasts. Identify those efforts with the most variation. Now that you've stopped starting and you're just clearing out the backlog of stuff that's already in progress, you will be able to identify the stuff with the most variation. You'll start to see, well, it took us 3 days to do it this time, and 7 days to do it that time, and 4 days to do it. Well, why is that? That's crazy. This takes plus or minus an hour, or this takes 8 hours every time. But this over here, it's plus or minus days, and so identify things like that. Those will be your highest sources of lag, no duh, and start dealing with those. Identify work that you know can do the job right, that you can actually have some control over, that you can measure, and that you can stabilize. You can take out the inefficiencies, you can add the resources, whatever you can, you actually have some control over those processes and those activities that work. If you can do something about it, you know it can be done, this is the right activity, it gets the job done, you have control over it, so it's not like it's relying on an external third party that you have no control over. This is something that's all within your walls, you can deal with it. You can clearly, if you can't measure it, then it's kind of wondering why you're doing it. And if it's something that is, you figured out, or on the path toward figuring out what's causing stability issues, you can start to stabilize it so that it's a little bit more predictable in a consistent sense. Not necessarily in a quantitative sense, but it's stable in a, you can see it's not jumping around too much. It's not affected by the weather, for example. So in the universe of work, there's all the work that you don't know. And there's all the work that is sometimes not even in your control at all. You don't even know it's happening. Then there's work that you know. From that work, you can create, some of the work can be defined as processes. From that, you can subset, you can take certain data, and from that data, create baselines, and from the baselines, create predictive models. And so there's not everything is going to have a model around it. But for those things where you can have, you know what it is, you can have a process, you know the processes can produce data, the data is clean, it's, it's clear the data is from this process and not from 20 other processes. From that, you can create the baselines. The baselines are simply, what are we capable of doing? It's, it does, because it's a wild baseline, doesn't mean it's always a bad baseline. But so you know what the baselines are, and from a subset of those, so this is not, obviously these are not concentric, and they're also not, each one circle isn't the same size. Some of those will be modelable. You can create a model, and from those models is where we're going to get the predictability on the outside of the onion from what's going on the inside of the operation. The models will allow you to forecast performance and feed your decision-making process. So what ends up happening, and this is just a very crude representation of what we're talking about, the green curve is a model. Statistical, if you want to call it, process control, whatever you want to call it. The data points are the myriad of data that everything's producing, and now based on the model, we know that this is the right decision, as opposed to our previous approach, which was all kind of based on our own internal biases and thinking and analysis. Now, obviously, not every decision is going to be modelable. Not every decision is going to be is going to be quantitative in this nature, but there's no operation in our world where every single thing that we do is completely not quantitative, and we're making these decisions not based on what we know we can do. And again, once we get the lag out, in fact, even though this is the end of the talk, in most cases, for the most part, I want to make something very important, make a point that's very important. Even if you never get to this, even if you never get to this, there's a tremendous amount of value in just finding the sources of lag and variation. Even if you never get to this. This is where the real game-changing, performance-enhancing business performance happen. But oops, I'm going the wrong way. And so there's tremendous value in a lot of this. So I've said nothing about wholesale changes to the work. Start where you are. It's about gaining insight into it, so start where you are. Now, once you've identified certain things that aren't working, you might be compelled to cause changes in your organization. I didn't do that to you. All right, so these are behaviors, not recipes. I noticed I didn't give you exact ways of doing anything. The improved visibility, so this is the summary, obviously, provides direct line of sight from the peel of the onion at the end into the center of what's going on by reducing uncertainty through lower variation and less lag. And I've got about 10 minutes, I believe, for questions.
Yes, let's have some questions. Can you guys hear me?
or this?
Yeah, you can hear me now. Yeah, let's have some questions. And but before we go and have any questions, I want to say the one graphic that I'm taking back immediately to my boss and my boss's boss is the roadway one.
Yeah.
I think that is super powerful.
Thanks.
That was worth the whole. Well, there was a lot more here than just that, but just the whole talk about value trumping flow and flow trumping waste, and that really helped me a lot. So, do we have any questions here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a question. First, I want to let you know.
Cool. See, told you.
Yeah, I want to help you.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could spend a little bit of time countering the view of what you're proposing as doing less amount of work in the same amount of time.
So if for those of you who could hear the question, some people would say that this is less work in amount of time, that we're paying people not to work. And in the actual truth is that it is less work if, and only if, we actually know exactly how much effort it takes to get stuff done, and we have accounted for, this is the second big, and we have entirely accounted for everything it takes to get the jobs done. Most organizations don't have those two conditions to start with. They don't account for all the work, and they don't know what it actually takes in terms of level of effort to get the work done. So there's all the work that we do, we don't know what it takes to get it done. And then there's just all this other stuff that we actually need to do that we don't account for. Now, if we are in a situation as a business where we know there's none of this pile over here that it actually takes to get the work done, so that everything we do is completely accounted for, everything we do is within our corporate capability to get it done, and everything runs like clockwork, then we're talking about a situation like you're saying, that people might be sitting around doing nothing. But presuming that it's not running perfectly like clockwork, then there's other work that needs to get done that allowing the slack to develop could be doing. And that's the, so if I've seen very few operations running that efficiently, and the idea isn't to get the operation to run like clockwork, because, you know, some of the best mechanical watches, where does the error come from? The error does come from not accounting for the lag in the gears, right? So we don't want to operate that way. You know, we aren't a clock. Our groups and teams don't have that kind of mechanistic precision, and we can't sustain that forever. So because we are people systems, we need the slack because we're not a clock. Yes?
If value trumps reducing waste and taking into account also deadlines, this is almost like you're giving a free check to just get it done. It doesn't matter about doing it correctly. It doesn't matter about, you know, all the processes. Our value is to ship the stuff on time. Therefore, everything is about.
If we allow ourselves to say that delivery equals profit or delivery equals value, then while that's a lie, what you said is true. But value is not value. That becomes a question of how do you give yourself credit for having delivered value. It's not going to be shipped back because of defects. It's going to be accepted by the customer. It's going to be paid for. It covers what we can charge for it, covers all of our costs of building it, including the cost of rework if necessary. But if we simply define value as it left the building, then that's not the value definition that we're using to trump, you know, value trumping flow. So what it means is that no system exists without waste. And so there's always waste in flow, there's always flow, or if there's no flow, there's no value. But sometimes the way to look at the value trumping flow is that if it's shipped, the best way in our environment is if you ship it and it comes back, you have not shipped value. You have actually caused additional flow problems. One of the most common occurrences that I've encountered in just about everywhere I've ever gone is allocation of available new product development resources has almost never taken into account unplanned rework from previously delivered products. That the same people who have to be building new product are the only ones who can fix the old product. And even when it is accounted for, it's a wild guess and nowhere even close to the amount of rework that actually comes in. So that's the definition of value.
Can you say that again? When you ship something, I love how you wrote this down. I want to write that down.
Oh, shit.
Or can somebody else?
So when you ship something, it doesn't come back and disrupts the amount of the resources that you had planned to build new product. I mean, that's as much of it as I can remember. Are you recording this? What?
It's because it doesn't have rework.
Right. If you ship it and it doesn't come back because of rework or of some source of rework, you ship it and it doesn't come back, that's value. And of course, you charged enough or correctly for it. That's another discussion. Sometimes I don't like getting into the cost issue because there's lots of things that you ship that you're not charging right for. Yes?
With Agile, you give an estimate of a piece of work, and then at the end of the sprint, you figure out whether your estimate is right or not. What's the best? Is that in the retrospective that you would start to do some analysis, or is it something that you keep outside of a sprint process to determine the actual amount of time that it took to get something done?
So yes, it's often in the retrospectives we'll have we want to figure out a little bit. I put a little bit more structure into the retrospectives so that we do address. All right, so this is what we said we would do. This is what we actually got done. There's a delta. We have to acknowledge the delta. And then maybe not at the retrospective, but at least acknowledge the delta and maybe put together some ideas around it. Frequently, the retrospectives, because of the way they're focused, you could end up easily running down a rat hole because the deltas we don't know them yet. So the retrospective is not always the best place to do the analysis. But to acknowledge the deltas and to think about maybe the top 3 things that would have had the most influence on the bad estimate for that sprint. But not try to resolve them right there and then. Yes, ma'am.
At the beginning, you started off your presentation saying that it's not good to look at past data, which is something most of us are probably accustomed to doing. What is a scenario when it is broken?
So I want to thank you for bringing that up. We are always looking at past data. What I was saying is that if we're only looking at past data, and we don't have the ability to forecast based on known capabilities. So we're always collecting data, and it's always in the past. But if we only collect data that is the lag between the event and the data collection and the decision on that, and that's the only way we make decisions, that's the problem. It's not that we can avoid. Data is always in the past. So if that's the only mechanism we have, where then once we've collected the data, which is now old and only getting older, as we go through the traditional decision-making process, and there are stuff that there's certain things that are, the circles that all met at the bottom with that model at the end, there's just stuff that's never going to make it all the way down to the modelable stuff, and it's really not, you don't want to get down to the modelable stuff.
Sure.
Anybody else?
One more question, but before we get the
Winner.
Before we get the last question,
Chicken lunch.
We do have lunch at 12, and also please make sure to fill out the survey. It's online, and there will be instructions in your materials. So, our last question.
Go ahead.
So sometimes there is this perception in our industry where all developers are created the same, and that we're going to say, hey, look, he's going to charge X dollars an hour versus this other developer.
Right.
And that's how, we're going to find the lowest bidder.
Right.
And so
That's kind of this other gentleman's question as well. Getting paid to do nothing is two things. One is that you shouldn't ever be in a situation where you're actually doing nothing. Two, sometimes that's more effective than being paid to do the wrong thing, or being paid to do something that's going to be thrown away later. There's no value in doing it, meaning it's not throwaway stuff for prototyping and figuring it out. That's all great. But it's usually a product management issue, believe it or not a development issue. And so but let me address the real first one, is that the paid to do nothing part is a symptom of lacking cross-functional capabilities within the team. And I actually have a client, had a client when I did this kind of thing, who basically said to his team, he had 36 people on the team, and he basically said, all of us are going to become cross-functional. And some of us are going to be product management, some of us are going to be mostly business analysts, and but all of us all the developers and the testers and all the other things, we're all going to be cross-functional. And that's the direction we're going. And if you don't want to be part of that, we'll help you find outplacement within the company. And like all but 3 people said, okay, I'm in. So they ended up only losing a few people who just did not, I want to be in my box, leave me alone. But overall, most of the time, there's never nothing to do. There might be stuff someone doesn't want to do. There might be stuff that is, if the backlog of future possible product isn't full, that's a product management problem. So then you can have somebody investigating something that's still not in development, or just do more analysis on something. But usually for people, if people are actually in a position where they're doing nothing, I think that's more of a personnel issue than a system or a flow issue. Not that this is in any way divorceable from the people. We can't say, oh, we've solved the flow problem, but no, we're going to keep all the people and they can stay with the exact same jobs. One of the truisms about product and development and change is that if something's not working, continuing the same thing that's been doing is not going to make it better. Change requires change. It's, Einstein or whoever actually said that original, this kind of thinking that got us into this problem isn't the kind of thinking that's going to solve it. So, yeah, I know it was the last question, but I'm here, so.
I want to thank Hillel for a great invited speech.
Thanks for coming.